Boker Tov, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brodsky, James Brodsky. Hi, it's me again, talking to you about Taste of Torah and our Torah portion for this week. Oh, forgive me about that. Shalach Lecha. All right, go forth, or be sent forth, really. So, what is Shalach Lecha about? Well, you might have anticipated this. It's about espionage. That's right. The bulk of our Torah portion is taken up with spying, surveillance, and intelligence. Well, actually, faulty intelligence, but we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we do that, I also want to mention that, interestingly enough, as always happens with our Torah portions, it's rarely about just one topic, but oftentimes other things are included. And certainly at the end of our Torah portion, we encounter a ritual practice that we're still familiar with to this day, even though we may not fully understand it, and that is the practice of wearing ritual fringes. This is where the commandment to wear ritual fringes comes from. Now, of course, you know this object. It's a talit, it's a prayer shawl. This is a big one. Whoop. And it's in some ways become kind of a canvas on which we do Jewish design and art and express ourselves. Mine here, for example, is clearly a rainbow. Now, when this was originally created, this style was intended to communicate kind of modern alternative Jewishness. It has now, because of the larger culture, become strongly identified with LGBT rights, though that was not the original intention of this particular design. But it is only one of many you now have options to do. I'm sure you have seen or you own a talit that has batik or the horizon of Jerusalem on it, or it has a tree of life, or all these different styles have come about. And part of the reason that that is possible, that we're not locked into the old tradition of black and white stripes or blue and white stripes, is because, in fact, this is not the mitzvah. The talit itself is not the commandment, the religious observance that we are doing. That's why also, while it's very iconic, we could use the blue and white stripes for the flag of Israel, which is inspired by the talit or talis. What's really going on at the end of our Torah portion are these guys, the ritual fringes or knotted fringes. It doesn't specify how the knot should work, and always in Jewish tradition, it's an open tradition. If the Torah doesn't specify how we're supposed to do it, we feel the latitude to step in and make it happen in a way that we find relevant. So in fulfilling the mitzvah, we've added to the mitzvah. And on this particular one, you'll find that there are alternating numbers of twists and wrappings with each knot, and it ends up that there are 5 knots representing the 5 books of the Torah, 6 knots that represent the 6 books of the Mishnah, the oral Torah, and then 7 knots for the days, and on it goes till we end up, I believe we end up with 13 knots or 13 twists, which represent the 13 attributes of God described to Moses in the book of Exodus. So, but let's talk about these fringes, all right? The original commandment, the commandment that you will read in our Torah portion, doesn't actually describe these, it describes these. Because the original commandment is to make a fringe that consists of white thread and multiple white threads with a blue thread running through it, which is called Tallitot. And it could be a dark blue, or it could be a sort of royal purple, but mostly it's been interpreted to be a sky or dark blue. And complicating, which is why you don't see this so often, is the fact that the blue has to be extracted from a particular animal, that animal being a kind of mollusk that lives along the coast of Phoenicia and northern Israel. And I believe it's called a murex, snail kind of thing. And by the time we got to the Talmud, the actual process, which was an ancient process, you could get either a magnificent, vibrant blue or you could get a royal purple out of it, had become something of a lost art. And as a result, the rabbis decreed that we should stop putting a blue thread in because we can't do it exactly the way we're supposed to. But that didn't mean we had to stop using the white threads. And as a result, virtually every talit you get today will have only white threads in it. Now, there is a machlochet. Machlochet is a controversy, and where would we be as Jews without controversy? For about a century now, the argument has been made that we have figured out how to make this color again. And there are many articles on this, some of them published by Orthodox rabbis. And now the Orthodox community is a little divided about whether one should have a blue thread again, because now we can do it. And, then it becomes a matter of who's the conservative, who's the radical, right? Is it more radical to insist that we don't do what the Torah actually commands us? Or is it more radical to return to what we did before we ran into this? Who's the conservative in their observance? Who is the radical? Who knows? All right. So, but you can now get kits as well as buying actually made Tallitot, that's the plural of talis, with the blue thread in it. More fun, and for us to understand the Reform tradition and how we got there is, by the 19th century, we actually pretty much set aside the wearing of fringes. We went to modern clothing, and once we did, we didn't look back. We have brought back the ritual talis that we wear during services. However, what you don't see is Reform Jews wearing the talit katan. That's the little poncho-like outfit that Orthodox Jews wear as underwear that has the four fringes on them. It's a four-cornered poncho. And if you watch shows like Shtetl or Unorthodox, you will see Orthodox men running around, coats off, maybe their shirts off, but they still have this poncho on. So one of the confusions, even in the Orthodox community, is this, that wearing these is not a mitzvah unless you're wearing a garment with corners. All right, so that's a technicality, but it's an interesting one that Reform Judaism seized upon, because modern clothing, since the 19th century at least, is tailored and has no corners. If you have no corners on your clothing, you have no obligation to wear the tzitzit. You have to go out of your way to fulfill this commandment by wearing an object expressly designed to be square or to have corners on it. As a result, even in Orthodox circles, if you ask an Orthodox rabbi, it's not halakha. It's not a requirement that you wear a talit in order to wear fringes. However, it is what is called a tikkun. It's a remedy or a act of piety that you are going to go beyond the measure of the commandments in order to fulfill this commandment. And so that's how these deliberately square objects of clothing came into existence. It was in order to be able to fulfill the mitzvah that you're not required to fill if you're wearing a plaid shirt from Ralph Lauren or anything like that. So if you're not wearing Tallitot, don't worry about it. If you're not wearing tzitzit, you're not obligated to wear tzitzit unless you go out of your way to wear really particularly square underwear. So, word to the wise. All right, now let's get to Shalach Lecha and what I was doing earlier. Of course, I brought in the James Bond theme, and the reason I did that is because our Torah portion's about spying. And actually, it's a very, very famous passage because this is the moment when the people have arrived on the east side. I'm imagining this as if I were looking at a map of the Middle East, on the east side of the Jordan River, what we today would call the country of Jordan. All right. And they're looking over the Jordan River into the land of Israel. And after about a year and a half, 2 years of travel, they've made it to the point where they're ready to enter the land. But in order to implement this, the commandment is given, send spies to assess it. And so Moses selects basically a representative from each one of the tribes, and they go in together as a surveillance team, and they travel the land, and they take a long route through the land to observe and see what's going on. Now, when they return, and this is the pivotal moment in the story, they all agree that the land is excellent land, that it is, as they say, flowing with milk and honey. One of the famous stereotypes that comes out of this passage is the image of two men hefting a litter, and between them there is a giant cluster of grapes, so big that it requires these two men to carry it. This becomes, interestingly enough, the logo for the modern Israeli tourism industry, right? Is two guys hefting a giant cluster of grapes. But in any case, so the land is fruitful to the point of ridiculousness. But at the same time, most of the spies respond by saying, and yet, these people are incredibly intimidating. They talk about the inhabitants of the land of Israel as if they were giants. Now, were they really giants, or was this a matter of perceptual inadequacy on the part of the Israelites? Impossible to say. And of course, Jewish tradition splits. We have the idea that there were giants because we have Goliath as part of our story. And in fact, in the book of Genesis, we are told that there were tribes or races of giants called the Nephilim and the Rephim, and there's a couple of Anakim, a couple of names for these different groups, and they were primordial giants. This is a cross-cultural myth that appears in many, many traditions. Of course, we've got the frost giants in Norse mythology, and we have the Firbolgen in Irish mythology. So the Titans in Greek mythology. So the idea that the world was first populated by giants is something that was very commonly believed in ancient times. Maybe it's because they encountered, I don't know, fossils of dinosaurs that popped out of the land every once in a while, and they thought, oh my God, look at that. So anyway, regardless, the people come back and they report not only that the land is full of giants that made them feel like grasshoppers, but also that the cities are well fortified. And that's a practical problem because, this now organized gang of slave refugees are not equipped to wage siege warfare. So as a result, the majority of the spies respond with a negative. We should not do this, we'll not be able to succeed, we will be overwhelmed by the inhabitants of the land, we will not be able to conquer. With the exception of two, Joshua, Moses's personal assistant, and another character named Caleb, both insist that we should have confidence in God and go forward. Now, they do not prove to be the majority. In fact, what we end up with is effectively a minion of naysayers. And that embodies the community. So the people become demoralized because the vast majority of the spies insist it's going to be too hard, and they give up. They say, we can't do this. Despite the words of Joshua, despite the words of Caleb, despite the encouragement of Moses. Any soldier or military commander will tell you that it doesn't matter how many soldiers you have. If they become demoralized, they're no longer an effective fighting force. And that's precisely what happens to the Israelites. They become demoralized, they become convinced they can't do this, and so they give up. And as a result, God becomes disappointed and furious. And God declares, and here we get to that moment. Remember, we've only been at this from Egypt for about 18 months, 2 years. God says, that's it. I'm tired of this generation. It's not suitable to go into the land and live as a free people. And therefore, I'm going to take you out into the wilderness again. I'm going to keep you out there. I'm not going to do anything terrible to you. I'm going to feed you and take care of you for the next 40 years, for the length of a generation. And when the generation of slavery, who were adults when they came out of the land of Egypt, have finally died away, then the next generation, who were children and have known freedom or are born while in the wilderness, those will be the Israelites who will lead into the land and succeed, because they won't be tainted by this slave mentality, this fearfulness, this inability to imagine success. And so this becomes the explanation for why we had to wander 40 years in the desert. It's not because we couldn't find a gas station with a map. It's not because Moses was a man and wouldn't ask for directions. It's because we failed to have the grit, the sand, the strength, the courage to go forward and trust God to help us. What can we take from this? Well, first of all, that just proves that the term intelligence, when it comes to spying, is a mixed bag, right? Because having gone 18 months, 2 years with God, helping us through every single aspect of our experience, why did they suddenly lose the ability to believe in God here? I don't know, but sometimes our frame of mind is more powerful than the reality we're experiencing. Sometimes we just can't, even though objectively it would seem obvious we can. And if it teaches us anything for today, for you and I, it is to remember that. It is to cultivate that idea that those who dare, to quote the Special Air Service, the British commando formation, those who dare win, right? If you are too obsessed with the idea of failure, you're going to fail. And so this teaches us the importance of forging ahead at a time when we see a resurgence of anti-Semitism, when we see that it's not just happening in Arab groups around Israel, or it's not just happening in France or in Sweden, where there's been terrible outbursts of anti-Semitic action. now we're seeing stories that pop up in Los Angeles and New York, and we're worried again, and we're more fearful. And that is intuitively natural. It's understandable. But those who dare win. Our Torah portion reminds us that we have to maintain an attitude of confidence and can do it in order to succeed. And if we do, we will. We've done it now for the past century. We've been able to make a good life in this land in America. And we've been able to restore the land of Israel, the land of our ancestors, to a modern Jewish state after 2,000 years. These are remarkable achievements, and they are not to be lost. We got to this point, we can go better than this point. And that is, I think, the most important message we can take away from Shalach Lecha, that be strong and of good spirit and carry forward, and we will triumph. So that's it from James Brodsky. And our lesson from the spies today, it's a negative lesson. They set a poor example, but with 3,000 years of perspective, we can see how it works. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week.